Okay, thanks everyone for coming. Today's subject I think is one of the most exciting subjects in software, I think we'll all agree, which is backing up your data. So before we begin, I'd just like a show of hands. I'm not going to pick on anyone, I just want to get some numbers. Who, as far as they're concerned, has backups of their data, or at least their important data? Quite a few. Right, okay, I'm not going to count them all, but we'll try that again later and we'll see. So when I said it's exciting, that's kind of a lie. What it really should be is scary. That is a much more appropriate title slide, apart from the fact it's off the edge of the screen. So let's look at some ways in which you might not have backups. One of which is that you don't actually back up all your important data. And this sounds pretty obvious, but it's happened to me several times now that people have asked me for help with recovering some data. And when this happens, I always ask them about their backups, not to make fun of them, or at least not just to make fun of them, but also to try to remind people and encourage people when they're in the mood to that they should have backups, because when nothing's going wrong, you don't tend to think about it. When something has just gone wrong, that's a good time to remind people of the importance of it. And what I find quite often is that people tell me that they don't have backups because it wasn't really that important. Now, my view is that if you're willing to spend an hour or two of your time, or more importantly, an hour or two of my time, trying to recover some data, then you should probably have had it backed up. So it's worth bearing this in mind and going through your data, really thinking about what it would be like if you lost it. People often don't think about things like, web bookmarks, that sort of stuff. So it's even worthwhile, if you've got a laptop, say, and you think, well, there's nothing important on there, try taking the disk out and using a different one or using a different laptop for a bit and see if you miss stuff. You might not have data, you might not have backup if you consider RAID to be your backup. Now, RAID is not a backup. Oh, okay, so what we're talking about there is this is fine, right? You can use RAID in a backup system. There's no problem with that. You can use it in your normal system too, that's fine. What we're talking about is a system whereby you've got one system and you put in RAID, say RAID 1 for redundancy, and you go, I've got backup. No, you don't. And it's not particularly controversial. If you look online, if you look at discussions all over the place, people will tell you that RAID is not backup. And yet, despite this, quite often, both online and in person, people will say, well, okay, but it kind of is, right? I mean, I know it's technically not backup, but it is really backup, isn't it? It definitely isn't. Let's compare what these things protect you from. RAID protects you specifically from a detected failure of one or maybe some other smaller limited number of hard disks. And that's it. Backups protect you against practically everything else. Now you might think, okay, but disk failures are one of the most common causes of data loss. And that's true, but they're certainly not the only major failure cause of data loss. And it's worth bearing in mind that a lot of the statistics we get are from well-run data centers where they have a lot of disks and they keep stats on it, and therefore they'll tell you about failure rates and so on. And it's worth bearing in mind because in this sort of environment, you've got trained people with procedures, you've got generally no water pipes to leak, you've got them built with fire suppression systems, you've got an awful lot of stuff to reduce the other risks to the data. And at the same time, they're quite harsh environments for hard drives because of the temperature and vibration. So in this sort of environment, you would expect hard drive failure to make up a lot of your data losses. It's worth thinking whether your data, which you're keeping yourself, is in this sort of environment or something more like that. Because when you don't have those procedures and those protections, the other factors become much bigger. Not that they're trivial to begin with. And I think the really big thing, which is the sort of underappreciated risk to your data, is human error, i.e. the biggest risk is you. And that's just not something people tend to think about. When people think about losing their data, they think about a disk failure or a fire or something else happening to their disk. They don't usually think about themselves. You also don't have backup if you're not backing up frequently enough. This depends upon your needs. So you might be backing up every week, you might be backing up every day, you might be backing up every year. All of those might be fine if you're happy to lose that much data since your last backup. But quite often people don't think about it. They'll put in weekly backups when really if they lose a week's worth of data, they could be in quite bad trouble. So you have to think about that. You also have to think about how quickly you can restore. And again, this is down to requirements and needs. For personal data, quite often you're happy to be without it for a while. For a business, you might be in big trouble if you can't get it back for a week or two. And particularly with online backups, this may mean that you need to be able to restore with a certain level of granularity. Because if you can only pull down all the data in one go, that may be very slow. Plus, if you pull it down in an image or something, you then have to go and extract the data you want. And in a situation where you've just nuked one file, that's a massive pain. And therefore, you don't really have a backup if it's too expensive and troublesome to actually get it back. You also don't have backup if it's too expensive to restore. This usually isn't a big problem, but it's something to watch out for online backups. Some services work on a system whereby putting data into them is free or cheap, but getting it out is expensive. And it's one of those things that when you put it into place when you've got a small amount of data, it all looks quite reasonable. And then when you find that you've accumulated a much larger amount of data, it becomes prohibitive to actually get it back again. You need to be on top of that too. You definitely don't have backups if you don't verify your backups. If you write a backup somewhere and just leave it there, that doesn't really count. If you're not verifying that they're still okay on a fairly regular basis, they may as well not be there. We'll go into some reasons for that later. And you don't have backups if you don't practice restoring from backup. Because if you don't practice restoring, you might find that your procedure doesn't work, that you're missing something, that you don't have an encryption key, that you don't have some hardware. You might find the other side of it is that if you don't practice, then you have a significant risk that when you do restore, you're actually going to do more damage. You don't have backups if you don't have an off-site backup. Now, obviously, when we say off-site backups, people tend to think about natural disasters and earthquakes and fires and all sorts of big things. And those happen. So it's worth considering those. But they tend to think, well, OK, if that happened, maybe my data wouldn't be my biggest concern. But there's lots of really much smaller things that can happen as well. Small floods from burst pipes. Lightning strikes affecting the electrics in a building. There's lots of small stuff that can happen to a geographic location, particularly if you've got it in the same place in the building. So really, nowadays, you should be having off-site backups for pretty much everything too. And this one's more of a rule of thumb, but it's a really good rule of thumb. If you only have one backup of your data, you don't really have backup. Again, there's a number of reasons for this. Part of it's to do with the probability of multiple failures. Another one is simply the chance of you breaking something when you're trying to restore. You also don't have backup if wherever your main copy is can just overwrite your backup. So if, say, you have a computer and you have, say, Windows share that you can write to, and your backups are you copy your files onto that Windows share, you don't have a backup. Because if you get malware or even a direct, a personal attack, a hack or whatever else, or even someone physically at that computer, they can destroy your local data and your backups at the same time. You don't have backup if it's not really your backup. So lots of people have data in cloud services, which is fine. But then people think, well, OK, these cloud services, they have backups, which is true. But they're not your backups. Now, this may not be true if you're talking about a business-to-business service where you've got a lot of visibility and detailed contracts. But as far as consumer cloud services, this is pretty much true, right? The problems are, first of all, lack of visibility. You assume they've got backups, but you don't really know how good they are. And even if it's a large company, sometimes they don't have the quality of backups you might imagine. Even some fairly large companies now, when they started out sort of with new services, they didn't initially do backups. They didn't promise backups. You might assume they had them, but they didn't say they did. And when they were kicking it off, they didn't have them. Even if they have really good physical backups, you don't know if there's someone in that company, maybe a sysadmin, who might become disgruntled. Not that sysadmins ever become disgruntled. We know they're the happiest people in the world. Who could wipe out your data and the backup at the same time. You don't know this. The other side of it is just because they have backups doesn't mean to say you have access to them. They have backups because for them, for their business, it's going to be embarrassing or expensive to lose other people's data. However, if it's your fault, then the risk to their reputation from not being able to give you a restoration is fairly low, unless they promise you a backup service, which most of these cloud services don't. They'll tell you they've got backups. They're not your backups. And the other side of it is that there's, you can have problems generally with your account. I'm going to give you some examples of this in a second, whereby it's a common failure mode essentially, whereby if they say, right, something happens in their business, which either says maybe the entire business goes down because they suddenly become bankrupt or something, or there's fraud, or because they say, right, okay, delete all this person's data, maybe they've got a GDPR request so they think they have to, then that could affect their backups at the same time. So here's some screenshot examples. This is all of these, by the way. I'm picking on Google Docs or Google whatever else they call it when it's for businesses. I'm not saying that it's just Google Docs that have these problems. It's just a really easy one to go to where business is affected by it. This is where somebody discovered this interesting feature of Google Docs, at least at the time, whereby one of their employees created a load of important documentation. And then that employee left, so they removed that employee's account. And that documentation created a long time ago, which all sorts of people had looked at and contributed to, was automatically removed. And that's according to the rules that Google will tell you. They tell you that's the way it works, that if you want to remove an account, you better transfer all of the ownership of their stuff over first. But it's not what a lot of people expect. Someone had a big issue with this in their company. The main response they had was, so they were also asking about backups, because there's a thing that says that they can keep their data for 30 days. And the general response was, no, you can't get anything back. Here's 8 other examples where this has happened to other people recently. This is another case where a company, they did something wrong in the sense that their domain that they were using, they stopped using, they transferred it over, they still had the old domain connected to their Google Docs account, or whatever. Again, what's Google Docs when it's a business? It's called something else. They then didn't get some notifications about something, and as a result, their account got nuked. And the initial response from Google was, sorry, there's no restoration. As it turned out, they did get some, or well, most, maybe all, it's not quite clear, of their data back. But that was after an initial no and after lots of PR. And it took a while, I think at least a couple of weeks. And in a later comment, where they were discussing this on their blog, someone raised some criticisms about how they'd done things. And number 2 was you had no backups, and the guy said, yeah, guilty. Google had backups. They weren't their backups. You don't have a backup. This is a bit of a harder one to make the case for, because this is difficult to protect against. But you don't have backup if you don't detect corruption or failures in your main copy. The problem is that a lot of backup systems have some form of history, often because you do incremental backups. But people don't normally bother about preserving that history. If you move backup systems, you don't normally try and move over all your old incremental backups in your backup history. What you do is you take a new backup of your system and then decommission the old one. So almost all of the time, people will eventually lose the complete backup history of their system. Because what they're thinking about is, I want to restore stuff I've lost when I've just detected it. So, and this can happen, this has happened to me. If a file becomes corrupt, and this can happen in a number of ways, it could be corrupt on disk at some point in the dim and distant past, and you don't notice it, then by the time you do notice it, you may no longer have a backup of the good file. This isn't a big problem a lot of the time, but if you've got, say, a ton of big data, like, when I say big data, I mean big files, like, video files and stuff, then you've got an awful lot of stuff that can become corrupt that's not easily detected, because unless you watch through the entire video, you may not spot it. It's kind of more difficult to protect against. One way is to try and keep up like a complete history of all your backups. I'm not aware of anyone who does this normally, although if you're in like sort of a highly regulated environment, you might do for all sorts of reasons. Another way is sort of application level checksumming, and this is the sort of thing that we quite often do in Unix land. If you've got a big load of media files which don't change, you can go and use MD5 sum or any signature. It doesn't have to be cryptographically secure. Take a whole load of checksums and then check them occasionally to see if stuff's changed which you don't expect. You can look for unexpected changes in terms of when you do an incremental backup. You can have something which says, hey, is all these things changed that don't normally changed? Or you can have a file system that checksums data, or combinations of these. These are all techniques to help you protect against it. There's no 100% technique, because fundamentally, if you have a data set which you are expecting to modify, reliably detecting correct modifications from incorrect modifications isn't really doable. But you can do a lot to protect yourself against random bit rot on disk. So file systems that checksum data, I think, are the way things are going. If you're in Unix land or Linux, you have ZFS and BTRFS, Btrfs. all of these file systems I'm mentioning are kind of advanced file systems, and they tend to be copy and write, and they do snapshots and all sorts of other cool features. Windows has ReFS, although it doesn't have all the features that their NTFS file system has. macOS, a couple of years ago, introduced checksumming for metadata, but not for the actual data itself, which is kind of a bit weird, because if anyone's aiming at the target market of people who have lots of big files and stuff, videos and things, it tends to be Mac. What you can do, whether you're on macOS or some other system where you don't want to use one of these file systems, that you can put or at least store your bulk data on a NAS, network attached storage device, which does use one of these things, like FreeNAS, which is what I do. And that's generally recommended. If you're like doing video production and you've got tons of data, you probably want to do something like that rather than just having everything on a computer anyway. But as I said, a lot of people don't protect against this, and it's not the easiest thing to protect against. So it's one of the more forgivable things not to cover. Okay, so having just said all that, hands up again, not picking on anyone. Who has backups of their data? See, I was right. You don't have backups. Is that Daniel? Sorry, I said I wouldn't pick on you. You think you may have backups? Okay. Okay, but hopefully I made a point with that. Okay, so we're going to talk about data durability, i.e. not losing your data. We're going to talk about some backup media techniques, and I'm going to give a couple of examples of backup strategies which probably work for not everyone, but a lot of people. A lot of individuals, a lot of sort of small organizations and businesses. I'm not going to talk about like specific backup software, solutions, cloud providers, and so on. A couple of reasons for this. First of which is that I don't use any of them. In Unix land, we have a lot of very powerful commands like tar and rsync and rclone and all these sort of things which can very easily be glued together with a bit of scripting into a backup system. And that's what a lot of people do in Unix land. That's pretty much what I do in Unix land. So I'm not going to say, hey, install this backup software, because I don't use anything off the shelf. The other thing is that even if I did, you have to be very careful nowadays, because it seems that it's happening more and more that there's some like sort of well-used piece of commercial software or semi-commercial software. Everyone really likes it, and then they go and do something horrible. So when someone watches this YouTube video 3 years down the line, and I say I recommend X, Y, Z, it may be rubbish by that point. So instead, I'm going to be talking about what you're looking for from a backup system, and the more fundamentals about media. Okay, so data durability, i.e. the chance like not losing your data, is kind of the key point of backups. But it's very important. It's not the only important thing. We mentioned before speed of recovery, cost of recovery, keeping your backup secure, all those other things. So durability is not the only thing to think about. But if you don't think about durability, then there's not much point in having backups. I did look at like the maths of trying to calculate model and calculate data durability for different backup systems, and it gets really complicated. Partly that's because it's kind of people tend to model it in discrete maths, whereas actually it's continuous, and partly it's because there's an awful lot of factors with correlations and stuff that you could model, and different people who give numbers of 9s for their backup service will have different calculations they use to calculate that. So I'm not going to go through the maths, but I'm going to describe what we're trying to do. So if you can imagine, so this is time going across left to right, you have n copies of your data. So you have, say, your main copy, that might be on a laptop, and then you've got one or more backups, or maybe 0 or more backups. Let's say we've got a single backup, which is an external drive. At some point in this time, as time goes on far enough, probabilistically, you're going to have times where those will fail. And there'll be a period of which they have failed and are not available to get your data from. And that period obviously is affected by how quickly you detect the failure and recover from it. If at any point all of your backups are unavailable at the same time, you lose the game. Your data's gone. So the name of the game is not having that happen. So one of the things to bear in mind is common mode failure, i.e. a single event which can take out one or more backups, one or more copies of your data. So this could be human error. It could be a lightning strike. It could be a fire. It could be malware. It could be all sorts of things that they affect more than one copy at a time, particularly if you put them in the same location or you give one access to the other. You need to try and reduce those. You're always going to have some level of correlation, some possibility of it, because you're always going to have some connections. You probably don't have your data each on a completely different continent. You're going to have some level of potential for common mode failure, but you need to reduce that and not have it common across certainly all your backups. You also get other correlations. For example, I mentioned it earlier, restoration-induced failure, whereby trying to restore your backup ends up doing damage. So this could happen, say for example, that you have a computer and it sort of breaks and you find your disk is dead. So you'll get your backup disk and you plug it into your computer. And it turns out that it was a broken power supply and now it's killed your backup as well. Or it could be that that computer had malware on it. A number of things that can happen. And again, it can be human error. It could be when you went to restore it, you got it wrong and copied the data in the wrong direction. And from looking online, that happens more often than you might imagine. So this is another thing pointing to 3 or more copies, and it's also a thing pointing to practicing restoration so you know how to do it. The other thing that obviously matters is how often these failures happen, which is another way of saying how reliable these copies are. Obviously, if they're all failing more often, there's more chance of them overlapping. A big factor, which I think is often underrated, is failing to detect or recover from a failure. So this goes down to verifying your backups, seeing if they're intact. Because this in many ways is a much more important factor than, say, reliability. Because if you have a number of copies, when they fail occasionally and you quickly detect it and you restore them, then you keep a good number of copies all the time. If you put a load of data on a disk and stick it in a drawer and expect it to still be there later, eventually it's going to go bad. You won't notice, and eventually all your copies will go bad. Maybe you're not your main copy because you'll tend to notice that anyway. But if you don't verify your backups, probabilistically, over time, they'll go bad. And this is a really underrated thing. When people do backups, particularly their own solutions with their own media, they don't think about this a lot of the time. And obviously, the number of copies you have is a factor as well. The more copies, the better, as long as they're not too highly correlated. If you have 2 copies of data on the same hard disk, then yeah, it may help a little bit. It's not a great backup, right? So as independent as possible, having more copies is good. So, having enough copies, I mentioned 3 copies before, that seems to be a sweet spot. If you look at the charts of like reliability, that seems to be where you where you get really diminishing returns after 3 copies, but more may be appropriate. Avoiding commonalities that make it easy for multiple copies to go bad at the same time, verifying your copies, as I just said, practicing your restores, and obviously you want to choose more reliable media over less reliable, but in many ways that's probably one of the less important factors compared to how you manage your backups generally. Okay, so it's worth mentioning encryption. I use encryption for pretty much all the data I've got, which is probably what you'd expect. And an advantage for encryption specifically for backups is that if you have strong, good encryption, i.e. not some secret source or some weird product you never heard of, but actually sort of standard, well-known encryption that you're using with good key management, you've got strong passphrases and so on, then that basically means that you can keep copies all over the place and not worry about them being disclosed, which makes it easier to have off-site copies. So it's a really good feature. But it's worth mentioning that encryption can reduce the reliability of a particular copy. The way most of these crypto systems work is that they have particular points of really important data, whereby you say use a passphrase, that passphrase really unlocks a key, that key is written to one or more places on that copy, but if all those copies of the key goes bad, even if your entire copy doesn't go bad, you can't get the data. It's not a big factor, but it's worth bearing in mind. It is a downside. And you also, of course, need to use strong passphrases to get the advantage of encryption, and you need not to lose the passphrase. One of the problems here is that if people use automated backups, the backup system knows the passphrase or the key or whatever is required to write the encrypted backup, but by the time you actually come to need the encrypted backup, you maybe have forgotten where that key or passphrase was. And you do see still people on the internet going, I've got this strong encrypted data and I've forgotten the key, can I get it? And it's like, well, hopefully not, because that's the whole idea of the encryption. Okay, cloud backup, which according to Google Image Services Google Image Search looks like that. For the reasons I said earlier about their backups not being your backups. At least most of the time, a cloud backup service is one copy. They may have their own backups, and in some cases they may sort of expose that to you and say, okay, you can get it from this data center and that data center. You know, if you get the more technical services, maybe this doesn't apply quite so much, but you still have all the risks about your account and so on getting closed. As a general rule, an online backup service is one copy, no more. You have to consider restoration speed. If you accumulate data on an offsite backup over time, how can you get it back? Can you pull out a single file? Do you need to download the whole lot? How much does it cost to do so? Some services, I'm not going to mention the name just in case they do horrible things later, but one fairly well-known backup service now gives you an option for them to mail you disks of your data. So it might still take a day or two, but it can be a lot quicker than downloading terabytes of data that you've accumulated. As a general rule, if you're using a cloud backup service, they should be encrypting the data on your machine before it goes to that service, and you should be keeping hold of the keys, which does mean that you need to manage the keys or passphrases. But what that means is that if some random hacker breaks into their service, they can't just easily get all your data. It's worth bearing in mind that you're still trusting the service, though, because you're probably using their software. Unless it's some open source thing, you're probably using their software to do it. So you're trusting the fact that their software isn't just sending your keys off, right? So it's not a way of completely distrusting the provider. It's just a way that it's much more secure if it's on their systems, if it's encrypted with your key. And the other big thing to bear in mind is commercial sustainability. Because in backups and hosting and all sorts of services, there are new startups all the time in little companies, and they quite often have really good introductory deals, like, you know, pay us $100 and you can store as much data as you like for life. That lifetime can be quite short with those sort of deals. That's a mayfly. So you need whatever you want to store it with, you want it to be commercially stable. So it doesn't mean to say it has to be immensely expensive, but you do want to know they're going to be there for a while, because even though, like I said, the reliability of any copy isn't the most critical thing, if you've taken the trouble to upload all your data to a backup service and there's a fair amount of it, then like having another one, and by the time you get another one, it's going to be a massive pain, if nothing else. Magnetic tapes still exist. They are nice and they're highly shock resistant, and you can drop them, but they're quite sensitive to environment. They will eventually lose their signal, their data pattern on them, because they're magnetic. Probably quite a while if you're in a good environment, and that means things like temperature swings, because if you frequently change the temperature of something, that tends to degrade magnetic fields. Basically, there's two big issues with them. You need to make sure you've got the hardware available for recovery, because data tape drives are not off-the-shelf things. And it's expensive unless you've got a massive amount of data to worry about. You're either looking at fairly old technology, in which case you've got relatively low capacity tapes, in which case you might need several to equate to a hard drive, or you're talking about the latest tape technology, in which case you're spending thousands of pounds for a drive. So, to be honest, in most cases, unless you're a big enterprise where you're doing all the maths on this, you probably don't want to be using magnetic tape. Unless you just like magnetic tape because it's cool and people are into it. People are into like old tech, or not old tech, but you know, enterprise grade tech and stuff. Okay, so hard drives, I'm saying internal hard drives, I mean bare hard drives. By the way, if you buy a hard drive and it looks like this, send it back. I put this one up because they all seem to use a picture like this when they're showing like a picture of a generic hard drive on an article or on like a store where they're selling hard drives. It shouldn't look like that. It should look more like that, okay? It shouldn't be open. Okay, so hard drives are still somewhat sensitive to environmental conditions. They generally care less about things like humidity and stuff than tapes. They are actually quite shock resistant. People tend to think that hard drives, if you drop them, you will lose all your data. If it's switched on, then you might do. If the heads are parked, then it's actually quite resilient to actual shock. Although they're quite heavy, so even if you drop it, even if the shock doesn't actually sort of damage it internally, if it lands on a corner or something and breaks the PCB, that can still be a problem. But if you've got it in a container, it's much more resilient than people imagine. One of the issues you get with hard drives is that if you leave them on the shelf for too long, they can just fail to spin up because something happens with the spindle or the bearings and it tends to seize or get sticky. If you go for hard drives for backups, which I think a lot of people will or should, you might want to avoid enterprise or TLER hard drives. So the thing to watch out for here is that if you think, right, I want to go for the best hard drives for my backup, so I'll buy Western Digital Gold Series or whatever enterprise drives, they're not actually the best drives for backups most of the time. The reason for this is that they're designed to go in large storage arrays where if they fail, they want to fail fast and just go, I give up, so that the storage array can get the data from somewhere else and so that the disk can be replaced. Whereas if you've got a backup drive, you probably want it to act more like a desktop hard drive where if it doesn't get the data the first time, it tries a few more times. So enterprise drives tend to be more expensive and less appropriate for this. Watch out for SMR drives. SMR drives are a cheaper way of making bigger hard drives. And if you write sequentially to them, they're okay. If you try and do lots of random writes, the performance is absolutely abysmal just because of the way they work. In theory, they're great for backups, but only if your backup software works the right way. So verify before you use an SMR drive that it's actually going to work for your application. Internal hard drives can be used with an enclosure or a dock, they're generally quite a good backup medium for anything which is like hard drive type size data, which is what most people have. So on the left, that's an enclosure, which you can buy, stick a hard drive in, and on the right, that's a dock, which is what I tend to use. If you're going to use a dock a lot, then you want to have a little USB fan blowing air at it, because they're not great for thermals. But you might be thinking, well, if I'm going to buy a hard drive and buy an enclosure to put it in, why don't I just buy an external hard drive? Well, there are some reasons you might not want to. External hard drives are consumer products where they're generally competing on price. Quite often you'll find the cheapest thing they could find inside an external hard drive. Quite often even from another manufacturer. So you might buy a Western Digital, well, I'm not going to mention names just in case I sort of slander someone, but people have found cases where they buy an external hard drive from a hard drive manufacturer, but when if they open it up, they find a drive from a different manufacturer inside it, because that was what was cheapest at the time. The enclosures that external hard drives come in often have bad heat dissipation. It's not a big deal if you're just using them for short amounts of time for occasional backups maybe, but if you're leaving them plugged in, it's often quite bad. The big factor is that the USB controller is often a weak point, assuming they're USB drives. USB probably isn't the best thing for permanently attached storage anyway, but the USB controllers quite often fail. Now, you might think, okay, well if that happens, I'll just open up the enclosure and get the drive out. Well, with 2.5-inch drives, i.e. the smaller ones which tend to be bus powered, which people use with their laptops, nowadays the drives are quite often not standard drives plugged into a USB controller, they're integrated, which means you can't just unplug it and plug it into a computer. Even if it's a 3.5-inch drive, which generally are still separate, you might not be able to recover the data, even if the drive itself is good. There are two reasons for this. First of all, any external hard drive product which offers hardware encryption, even if you don't use the encryption, the way it normally works is that it encrypts it, keeps the key in flash memory storage somewhere, and then protects that in some way. And the idea for that is that you don't need to choose a really long passphrase, you can choose a short passphrase, and then after a certain number of attempts, the flash storage will go, no, you can't have it. Obviously, that's still subject to tampering with the hardware, but it's harder to attack. The problem there is that even if you choose not to use the encryption, quite often what happens is that the data on the drive is still encrypted, it just doesn't protect the key. So if you take the drive out, separate it from the controller, plug it into the computer to get your data back, you're not getting your data back. Another side of it is that even if the product doesn't have encryption, quite a lot of them do weird things where they have some data for their own purposes in like the first maybe 512K of the disk, or the first sector, the 4K sector or something, and they bump everything else along. So it looks like a normal disk over USB mass storage, but if you plug it into a computer via SATA, then it's all formatted incorrectly. And if this happens, you can potentially recover the data, but it's a pain. It's worth mentioning that external hard drives can, if there's good offers on, this is more in the US than here, although I have seen occasional good offers on Amazon Germany if you're looking for them. Quite often they can be a source of cheaper internal hard drives. This is called shucking, where basically you buy an external hard drive just to open it up and get the drive from inside to use it in something else. But these are reasons why you might want to consider using your own enclosure or a dock rather than using an off-the-shelf external hard drive. If you are going to use an external hard drive for backup, probably worth checking that you can actually recover the data if the USB goes bad. As I said before, the reliability of each backup isn't the most important thing, but given the prices are all fairly similar, you probably don't want to be getting something significantly less reliable if you don't have to. USB sticks and memory cards, because they're sort of similar technologies internally. We all know what they're like. They're expensive, you want a lot of data. The main thing about them is that they can just fail suddenly. Maybe depend on the quality of the drive, but I think a lot of people have experienced that. They certainly can make sense. If you're traveling around with a laptop, you don't have easy access to backup online. Backing up onto a USB stick for a short period of time is a good idea. I would generally choose 2 USB sticks because they're not that reliable, but I wouldn't trust them as a long-term backup. So if you've got your, sort of much beloved family photos, I wouldn't just be backing them up onto a USB stick. I'd choose something else. SSDs. Generally don't make a lot of sense for backups because you're paying for speed and you don't generally need that in a backup system. But USB SSDs of the type on the right can make sense as for on-the-go backups. So instead of using a memory stick, maybe use one of these. It's faster, it's probably more reliable as well. And optical discs are still a thing. Now, people tend to assume that if you have an optical disc, then it will just stay there and work forever. And a lot of the ones you buy commercially, pre-burned CDs and DVDs, have a good long lifespan. Although they can still rot sometimes if you expose them to excessive humidity and stuff. But the ones that you buy to burn stuff to, most of the ones you buy nowadays, they don't work by engraving into a material. They work by affecting a temperature. I want to say temperature, it might be light-sensitive ink in the actual CD. And they tend to have fairly short lifespans, quite often like design lifespans of like 2 to 5 years or something. That isn't to say they won't last for longer, but they're certainly not something you want to rely on as a long-term copy of something. That doesn't mean to say they're not useful. So I'm going to talk about later critical data, but say that you've got a relatively small amount of critical data. Say you're running a company and you've got some financial data which you really don't want to lose. What you might choose to do, since generic DVDs are cheap, you can store 4.7 gigabytes on them, and that's a lot for spreadsheets. You might decide that every month or every quarter, you take all your financial data, burn it onto a DVD and stick it in your car or something where it won't get too hot, hopefully. That's a really cheap way of having an extra backup, and encrypt it if appropriate, obviously. So they are useful, but you want to bear in mind that generic off-the-shelf optical media, it's not for burning stuff to and then sticking in a vault for 10 years. If you do want to burn stuff to an optical disc and stick it in a vault for 10 plus years, you can buy ones which are designed for archiving. Verbatim M-Disc is basically the only brand, I think. They do CDs, they do DVDs, they do Blu-rays. For some cases you might need, not all burners will work with all of the media, it depends. But in theory, and they're a bit more expensive, they're obviously a fair bit more expensive than the normal ones, but they're still not prohibitively expensive if you want to back up some important data. And in theory, they have really long lifespans. So I think for the Blu-ray, they said a 95% chance of keeping your data after about 600 years. Now, of course, they haven't actually tested any of these for 600 years or more than 100 years, so this is all based on simulation and modelling and tests. But they're probably still pretty good, okay? If you actually, do bear in mind they come with 10-year warranties, so, might give you an idea. But they're still pretty good. And if you've got relatively small amounts of data that you want to keep forever, like family photos and stuff, not a bad idea as an extra copy. Okay, so I'm going to take some water first. Something you hear a lot about or see a lot about if you look up backups online is what's called 3-2-1 backups. And it's one of those things a bit like model view controller, where lots of people say it's a good thing, but they kind of disagree on exactly what it means. So the rules are, have 3 copies, so that's like a working copy and 2 backups, of which I thoroughly approve. That's a good rule. And then the 2 is 2 different media, or sometimes 2 different types of media. So the classic example is put one, you have hard drives and say an optical drive, or an optical media. Although some people will say, no, it's different devices, so make sure that it's on 2 different hard drives. Well, every copy needs to be on a different device, otherwise it's not really a backup copy. So it's not exactly clear what that means. And for some people it might make sense to have, say, a hard drive copy and an optical copy, but if you've got 10 terabytes of Linux ISOs, that's what we all collect, isn't it? Then that's probably not a great way of doing it, because it's going to take quite a lot of Blu-rays. And then the one is have 1 copy off-site, although occasionally people will say offline. And both of those are actually quite good rules. Offline isn't as important if you have something that can't easily be overwritten by malware, but off-site certainly is quite important. So I've got a couple of different approaches which are not going to be appropriate for every situation, but are just kind of recommended starting points. Because people say, what should I do for backup? It's a bit like they say, what should I do for security? Well, it depends what you need, and everyone's needs tend to be different. The first thing I would generally recommend is try and get everything into ideally one place, or maybe a small number of places. So you just got to say 2 places, but you don't want 50 different devices, all of which you've got bits of data on that you want to keep somehow, and not having them corralled into one area. So in my case, I have everything on a NAS. Some of that data lives on the NAS. Other data is backed up onto the NAS from other devices or places it lives, or cloud places. So, for cloud services, I was saying don't rely on their backups. Most cloud services now give you an option to download all or some of your data. So that's a good thing to use to make backup copies, at least occasionally. So getting it all to one place, or ideally one, maybe 2 or 3 places, means that you can then back up those places. So in my case, I get everything onto a NAS, I then back up the NAS. A couple of different approaches. Approach A, I think, is probably the best one for quite a lot of people, which is to get a reputable cloud backup service with all the things I talked about earlier, i.e. you want your encryption, but you keep the keys. You want some protection against overwriting by malware, so that might be based on versioning, whereby your computer can write new copies, but it can't delete the old ones, or it might be based upon, there's all sorts of ways of doing it. But some protection, which means your computer just can't say to the backup service, right, delete everything, because, by the way, ransomware and stuff, they do look for backups now. One good cloud service, which means that you get your off-site as part of that, unless you happen to live in the same data center. And one local hard drive backup. Again, I would say an enclosure or a dock using an external hard drive isn't the worst thing in the world. I just think it's suboptimal. And keep that disconnected when you're not actually using it. It's just additional protection against lightning storm, lightning strikes and malware and so on. It's not perfect protection because you can have it plugged in some of the time, but it's a lot better than keeping it plugged in all of the time. Plus, if you have really critical data like irreplaceable family photos or financial records or that sort of stuff, which isn't massively big, then there's a good argument for making optical media backups. And again, if it's stuff where you're going to be making them all the time because you've got ongoing financial data and there's not that much of it, burning it to standard DVDs and just doing a new one each month or quarter or whatever is quite a good idea. If it's family photos and stuff you want to keep for more archiving purposes, I would look at those MDIS products. That seems like a good extra backup for those things. Suggested approach B is kind of similar, except if you don't want to use a cloud service, maybe your internet connection isn't that great, maybe you just want to manage it all yourself, then have 2 hard drive copies instead of 1 hard drive copy and 1 cloud copy. But keep one off-site at all times. So that means that when you need to swap them over, because you will, to backup, you take the on-site, you back up to the on-site one, you take that off-site, then you go off-site, bring the on-site one back, and then you've got that local copy. So at any point, you have 1 copy off-site. Don't do it the other way, because then you're bound to get the flood on that day, right? If you bring put them all in the same place. Plus, again, if you've got critical data, small amounts of it, optical copies are a good idea too. But either way, all the stuff I said earlier about managing them, verifying them, it's really important. If you don't verify this stuff, if you don't see if it still works, it will go bad over time. So to summarize, this talk was kind of inspired because this is a booming industry. This is a data recovery lab. And this is where people who I'm sure are very nice and have families and all sorts of things do diligent work in recovering people's data from them. They open up drives in clean environments and do all sorts of stuff. And this shouldn't really exist. Maybe for like forensic purposes where people have deliberately destroyed data, but these are springing up all over the place because people are trying to do it a bit cheaper, but it's still expensive. And really, we should be putting these people out of business, even though I'm sure they're really nice. So please, back up your data. Thanks. I think we've got a little... Yeah, go ahead. I didn't say